Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kira Zeileman with the NARUC Center for Partnership. Thanks very much for joining the webinar today. This is actually the first in a series of webinars that the Center for Partnerships and Innovation is holding. We aim these at commissioners and commission staff and other electricity stakeholders. We'll be following this webinar up with a series of Energy Water Nexus focused webinars in the fall. So please be on the lookout for that. The announcements will come out on our website, naruc.org/CPI, and through the NARUC listservs. So just one quick announcement before we start. We would encourage you all to ask questions to our speakers after they are concluded. So you can do that in two ways. There's either a question or a chat box, or you can raise your hands using the GoToWebinar toolbar, and I can unmute your line to enable you to ask a question. And the slides and recording of this webinar will be posted on our website. Again, that's naruc.org/CPI. So with that, I will turn it over to our moderator today, Commissioner Rosales from the Illinois Commerce Commission.
Thank you, Kira. Good afternoon, everyone. This is John Rosales from the Illinois Commerce Commission. I also serve on the board of directors for NARUC, and I'm the current president of the organization of PGM states, affectionately known as OPSI. I would like to welcome you to our webinar titled Growing the Innovation Muscle, How to Design, Execute, and Analyze Pilots for Electric Utilities. As customer needs evolve and new technologies emerge, utility companies are faced with the challenge of meeting customer needs and implementing new technology while maximizing benefits and minimizing the cost impact to their customers. Innovation is essential for utilities to meet this challenge and evolve into a utility of the future. However, innovation can be risky and expensive, causing apprehension among investors and uncertainty among us commissioners, regulators, who are charged with the responsibility of ensuring that service remains safe, reliable, and affordable. Pilot programs are a popular method used to encourage innovation and minimize risk by applying a unique concept to a limited footprint. But how do we define success or failure for these pilot programs? How can we ensure that the results will translate when applied at a larger scale? How do we better prepare pilots to quickly scale up if successful? And is there certain criteria that can be applied to the design of all pilot programs? The goal of today's webinar is to explore these questions and learn how regulators can encourage responsible risk-taking. Our speakers consist of two experts in pilot program design and evaluation who will discuss how to maximize learning potential, evaluate the results, and report the findings in a way that will translate to utilities throughout the country. We will also hear from a utility perspective on how to best incorporate pilot programs into their business model and engage with commissioners and their staff to enhance the process. The format of today's webinar will consist of short presentations from our four panelists, followed by questions and discussion. Our first panelist is Anthony Teixeira, a senior associate at Rocky Mountain Institute. He currently splits time between RMI's Electricity Innovation Lab and RMI's work with NREL on the Solar Energy Innovation Network. Our second panelist is Dr. Alex Davis, an assistant professor in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Alex teaches graduate courses in applied data analysis and stochastic discrete choice models. Alex earned his BS from Northern Arizona University in psychology and his master's and PhD from Carnegie Mellon University in behavioral decision research. I have to tell you, Doctor, this is off script here. I haven't heard Socratic discrete choice systems since my advanced stats class in Northwestern. This is not a subject or conversation that you usually overhear at the neighborhood pool hall, so I'm looking forward to your remarks. Our third panelist is Curt Kirkeby, a fellow engineer with Avista Utilities. He holds a Bachelor's of Science in Electrical Engineering from Montana State University and a Master's of Science in Engineering Management from Washington State University. He is a registered professional engineer in the state of Washington and has 36 years of experience in the electric and gas utility industry. Our final panelist is Josh Gould, Department Manager for Con Edison's Utility of the Future Group, where he focuses on incorporating external innovation, developing partnerships, and identifying new business opportunities related to the growth of distributed energy resources. Josh holds a Bachelor BA degree from Claremont McKenna College and an MBA from the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College. Gentlemen, this is one of the most distinguished panels that I've ever moderated, and I really appreciate and thank you for giving us of your time to be with us today. Anthony, I'll turn it over to you to start the presentation.
Great, thank you for the introduction. So as Commissioner Rosales mentioned, I'm here representing RMI's eLab, and today I'm going to be presenting some insights from our report, Pathways for Innovation, which was focused on utility pilots and demonstrations. So just a little bit of context on what went into this report. We partnered with 3 utilities, so Arizona Public Service, Avista, and Con Edison, 2 of which are represented here today on this panel, and really did in-depth interviews with numerous people at those utilities to establish best practices or identify best practices for pilot and demonstration projects. In addition to interviews with those utilities, we also conducted a wider range of interviews with other industry stakeholders, including utilities, regulators, tech companies, advocates, and experts, and compiled those insights into this report. So the first thing I wanted to go over was the difference that we see between pilots and demonstration projects and why this difference matters. So from our viewpoint, pilots and demonstrations serve very different purposes, and distinguishing between those different purposes helps to bring clarity and structure to the process of testing and scaling up a product. And so as you can see on this graphic, that inner circle is where we see the subject or the focus area of pilots. And so pilots are really focused on technical questions and also technical integration into the system. So they're really more for earlier stage projects or products. They're narrower in scope. And yeah, this is really focused on those technical issues. I also want to clarify when I say product here, that can be a pretty broad definition of product. So that could be a software platform, that could be a piece of hardware, that could even be a new rate design. Here we're just talking about new solutions, new products that can be deployed by utilities. And so as you move on to a demonstration project, and once you've kind of established the technical feasibility at the pilot level, you move into what we define here as demonstration projects, which start to bring in more of the issues that you need to, or more of the questions you need to answer in order to validate the business case for full-scale deployment of more mature products. As you move into demonstration projects, these projects become more integrated, and so they're testing more different pieces of that business case. And they also become broader in scope, so they might incorporate more customers, and as well as more different parts of the organization as well. And so the next piece I want to talk about is what Commissioner Rosales was talking about in terms of kind of this changing industry that really necessitates driving innovation at electric utilities. And so our recommendation is that utilities should really embrace that need to adapt to the changing industry. And to support that, really what the first step is to define a strategic vision. So in light of the changing industry, where do you want to be 5, 10, 20 years down the road? and how will you incorporate these new technologies and these new solutions on new customer demands into your business model. And so that first step is defining that strategic vision. The next step is defining a roadmap for how you might achieve that vision. And so that really lays out the key challenges, the key questions that you need to answer to be able to achieve that vision in the future. That's really a focusing mechanism to help you step through the most important questions over time that you need to answer. And then the last thing I'll say about this roadmap is that it really should articulate how the evolving utility business will provide benefits for both customers and shareholders, because ultimately that's what the utility business model is focused around, and so those need to be incorporated into your roadmap. So the way that the innovation roadmap interacts with pilots and demonstrations is that the vision and the roadmap, by identifying those key questions that need to be answered, the pilots and demonstrations are the vehicles for answering those questions. And so, you would based on the biggest questions that you have in your roadmap, you'd set up pilots and demonstrations that test those questions, and then the insights from those pilots and demonstrations would then feed back into refining that roadmap, identifying the next questions you need to answer, and potentially also refining your strategic vision. And so just to lay out an example here, from the third utility that's not represented on this panel is Arizona Public Service. And so in Arizona, they're seeing a lot of deployment of rooftop solar, as many of you might know. And so one of the big things that Arizona Public Service is working on is figuring out how to leverage those assets as system assets. And so they've kind of, in response to customer needs, to define a vision of their future where customer-sided distributed resources are serving grid assets that support grid stability. And so in light of that, they've launched a series of pilots and demonstration projects, the Solar Innovation Study, that's testing multiple different solutions, multiple different configurations that could lead to that future where they have these assets supporting the system more broadly. And so the insights from those studies or those demonstrations will lead to further refinement of their roadmap for how to integrate those assets onto the system. So how do we define failure for pilots and demos? Failure consists of running a pilot or demonstration project and coming away with inconclusive results or failing to identify and capture important lessons. I think this is really one of the core points that we want to make with this report, is that really learning is the objective. These are experimental projects, and that's the #1 goal. So to support that, we are making the recommendation that utilities are moving from serving load and maintaining reliability to providing compelling customer solutions. Therefore, they would benefit from developing solutions in what's more like a product development pipeline. And currently, in most cases, this is not something that exists as a structured process, and so it's unclear how projects move from those earlier stage pilots into larger scale demonstrations and then eventually into a rollout. So just a couple words about how we see this pipeline working is that at each stage you design a project that will identify, you first identify those key barriers you need to test, and then criteria in order to move to the next stage of the pipeline. And so you would establish clear criteria at each stage, at the end of each pilot, for example, that would tell you whether or not you'd move it into a demonstration. These should be defined up front so that when you come to the end of the project, you have a clear decision process that's based on well-defined and established in advance criteria. And you also want to make sure that those criteria encompass all the questions that would need to move to the next stage. So for example, in a demonstration project, if the next stage is a rollout of that project to your full customer base, or a phased rollout in chunks to your full customer base, then you need to make sure that all those questions that you need to answer in order to do that are answered in the demonstration, and that's identified up front in the planning process. One of the key things I think here is that there should be an expectation of scaling. So if the project meets the criteria, if the project answers those questions, then it should be expected to scale, and rather than it being kind of a one-off decision every time you have a project. And then the last thing I want to say here is that solutions at scale are really what drive the pipeline. You want to get to this phased rollout stage And that is what's kind of pulling projects through the pipeline. So the next thing I want to talk about is how you can, I guess, structure your organization effectively to support this pipeline and support scaling and moving projects through the pipeline. One thing that we saw a lot in our research was that these projects, demonstrations and pilot projects, are run by these small groups that are isolated, and they struggle to influence other parts of the company. And so we came up with best practices in 3 key areas that help utilities move projects through this pipeline. So the first is leadership accountability. And this is really about making it a part of business as usual. So at the senior leadership level, there should be pieces of the job description that are related to innovation, to adapting the business to the changing industry. And by doing this at the senior level, you connect it effectively to broader strategy, and it's much more likely that you'll have the support for those projects that you need for them to be successful. Number 2 is that you need to have dedicated staffing for these projects. So in some cases, for large organizations, it's possible to create a full group that's just solely dedicated on these projects. In other cases, that may not be possible. So if you can carve out time for this, within project teams or kind of standard teams, so that people aren't just doing this on top of their regular day jobs. And the third one is cross-organization engagement. We really saw 2 key reasons for this. And the first was to gather feedback to improve project design. And so, projects at scale often incorporate lots of different groups, lots of different considerations. And so by gathering feedback from those groups in advance, you can uncover barriers that you may not have foreseen without addressing those groups early. And the second is to generate support for these projects. And so by I guess, engaging with different parts of the organization during the project, then you're able to support scaling because people know about the project, they've given their input into their project, they have more ownership of that. And so when it comes time to scale, it's more likely they'll be able to support that project in scaling. And so just to give a short example here, so if it's probably not necessary, for example, if you're running a solar plus storage pilot, to engage your system planning group. But if you wanted to scale that solution up and you wanted it to be something that the utility could rely on as a system asset in the future, a virtual power plant, for example, then you would need to integrate the needs of the system planning group in your pilot, even though they may not necessarily need to be involved in the pilot. To build on that a little bit, you might also want to engage with the distribution operations group, even though that might not be necessary at this stage in the pilot because it's a small load or only a few systems. But then stepping back and thinking about what that project looks like, running a solar plus storage pilot that addresses those control issues that you might hear from distribution ops, some of the system planning needs that would allow them to incorporate it into their planning models, while still being compelling for customers because you're testing that customer engagement piece as well. That becomes a really compelling demonstration project that really tests a lot of the key issues that you might be facing today. So with that, I'll end and pass it on to my next panelist. Thank you very much for your time. The report's available online. Feel free to reach out to me or any of the other authors with any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. I have to interject as a former businessman. I find it difficult to have an employee engagement specifically for a pilot project. Large organizations like Con Ed, have that flexibility. For a smaller utility, that becomes a problem to have dedicated employees on this project. I have to tell you that. So I know we can get around it, and you talked about moving some where it becomes part of their job, during the day. But I have to tell you that one is a difficult nut to crack when you're in the real world. Just I have to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. It's a tough problem, and I think some of our other panelists might speak a little bit about setting aside resources for pilots and demonstration projects, which I think might support. When you have budget for that, then it might make it easier to dedicate staff time as well. So that's one potential. But I completely understand. Yeah, it's definitely a big challenge.
Dr. Alex Davis, ready? Please begin.
All right. Sorry, can I control the screen or no?
No, I think they'll do that for you, but you can always say when you want to move. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So can you just bring up my slides?
They're on.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not seeing them for some reason.
Hey, Alex, I'm sorry, you can't see the slides?
Yeah, no, no, I can't see them for some reason. I see the old slides.
Right now we have on the screen part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, and part 5. That slide.
Yeah, I can't see the slides at all. All I see is the old slides. I can just work off of.
Yeah, Alex, why don't if you can just go ahead with your slides, I can advance and just try to keep up with you here.
Okay, sure. All right, we'll see.
Part 1 through 5.
Yeah, all right, let me just bring them up really quick. Apologize for the, not sure what the issue is.
While we wait, I want to remind everybody that we'll have a number of webinars this year. This is the first one, and once we resolve the technical difficulties, hopefully we'll learn from it and move forward. But this is something hopefully that'll be something that all of us can learn from. Okay, Doctor, you ready?
Yeah, just give me 1 sec. I'm just pulling up the slides right now.
Well, your part 1, intro and qualitative discussion.
Oh, it looks like I'm having my internet. But yeah, so I can just go off of memory maybe. Yeah, so I apologize for the issue.
Well, part 1 was intro and qualitative discussion of RCTs.
Yeah, so I just want to talk about 2 things. One is the design and issues around trying to extract information and make inferences from these pilot studies. And the second is how to communicate that information. So I put all those parts up there sort of as a little bit of a humorous sort of academic joke. But this is part of a longer talk that I've given many other places that takes, several hours. Very, very important things are usually said. But just to give you a sense of the sort of very interesting history of trying to actually learn things from experimentation. One of my favorite examples is this case where there was this guy named Frank Mesmer who came up with this idea of animal magnetism, that there was sort of an unseen force that could heal people and you just had to channel it and all this stuff. And the King of France at the time was very skeptical of this and hired Ben Franklin, Antoine Lavoisier, and Guillotine to investigate this phenomenon. And they report some very bizarre, interesting, and quite hilarious experiments testing animal magnetism. And it is actually the first case of blind experiments where the subject themselves does not know whether they are receiving the treatment or not. In this case, the treatment was a tree or was some object magnetized. So there's a long and rich history around trying to really understand experimentation, but importantly, how humans interact with experimentation. So in prior work, I've worked with my colleagues here at Carnegie Mellon, just trying to outline the set of criteria that you need in a study to draw conclusions from it. And we drew on previous work in the medical clinical trials where things like blinding, randomization, volunteer bias, attrition, those are all critical aspects of a well-designed study that allow you to draw conclusions. So, for example, I don't remember which one's first. Which one's the first example?
Well, setting a standard for electricity pilot studies. That's where we're now told.
Yes. Yeah, so this is an article we published on this and on this topic. And so we go through all these different potential biases. We review existing studies from the 70s to up to 2012, looking at studies on using things like in-home displays, dynamic pricing, and automated technologies like smart switches and things like that. And we evaluate each of the studies for potential bias that one would need to consider in case, to assess whether we can actually draw conclusions from the studies. And so there's some examples of the potential biases. There are things like, are participants allowed to select the intervention that they're given? If different types of people select one tariff versus another, you might, draw the conclusion that it's the tariff that's having an effect when it's actually just the differences across people. And so we go through all these different examples, intervention selection, volunteer bias, blinding, and things like that, and we evaluate all the studies on these criteria. And what we find is that pretty much all of the studies were either at high risk of bias or unknown risk of bias for these potential issues. So by high risk of bias means we could actually assess the study and determine that the study was potentially suffering from volunteer bias or that randomization was not done correctly. And unknown risk of bias means that there was just not enough information in these reports to tell. So the conclusion was a lot of the studies have potential bias in them. The magnitude of those biases and their effects on the study, on the conclusions, is actually hard to quantify because of a lot of missing information. So,
so Doctor, just a clarifying question. Question, Doctor. So, are this is on utility pilots or just pilots in general?
Yeah. So this is a mixture of utility pilots. Some of them were run by academics as very similar pilot experiments. So it's a mixture, but I'd probably say about 60% were utility pilots.
Okay.
Yep. So so we actually, there was a big slug of money around the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act for smart grid investment grants, and this funded these consumer behavior pilots that tested a lot of the same things that we had reviewed in this prior research. And we evaluated these studies to see whether these biases were still as prevalent, and could we actually learn anything about the biases from these new studies. And it turns out that there were a couple studies that were extremely well designed and well thought out, which actually allowed us to get at a couple important issues. One of them was volunteer bias, which essentially had not been quantified at all in the prior literature. And this is the idea that people who participate in the pilot might behave differently than the general utility population. And so there were actually two studies that used what's called an opt-out design, where the people were assumed, the customers were assumed to be in the study unless they explicitly said they did not want to participate. And this the typical finding is that pretty much everyone fails to opt out. So pretty much everyone who's invited participates in the study, compared to opt-in, where you see many people rejecting. And so there were two studies, one by SMUD and one by Lakeside Electric. In these two studies, the one by SMUD looked at dynamic pricing and peak shaving effects. And what they find is that the change in electricity usage during peak hours for those who opted in was about twice as large as for those who were required to opt out. So the magnitude of the effect was twice as large among the volunteering group, suggesting that there might be a threat to generalizing to the population. And the second study looked at very much the same thing and found essentially no effect among the general population or among the opt-out group, compared to a relatively large effect among the people who volunteered for the study. So this was one of our sort of first quantitative estimates of the potential for this volunteer bias to impact these study results. The second one that I want to talk about is from Green Mountain Power. And Green Mountain Power used a very similar design for their study. In their study, they had a dynamic pricing program, and it was paired with different enabling technologies, for example, in-home displays. And what they did was they recruited people into the study. They randomized them properly to these different experimental groups, and some of them were given these dynamic pricing programs, and they were compared against a baseline group that was essentially not contacted at all. Okay, but the designers of the study cleverly thought, well, what if it's actually not dynamic pricing itself that's causing the behavior change? What if it is simply asking people to change their behavior? So they did include a group that was simply notified about the critical peak pricing event, and they just asked them to reduce their electricity use. And what they found was that they reduced their electricity use pretty much to the same degree as those with critical peak pricing programs. There was one group that also got an in-home display that had larger savings. In our prior work, we've looked at the interaction of in-home displays and critical peak pricing, and did not find much of an effect there. So this was sort of definitely an outlier from our prior work. So these new studies, because they were carefully designed and carefully thought through, were able to, learn some things about what the actual meaning of the intervention is. Is the intervention in this case simply saying, hey, you're in a study, please reduce your electricity consumption, or is it actually the effect of pricing? And so the last thing I want to talk about is just how to communicate these results. I've done a lot of work with Professor Fischoff here at Carnegie Mellon, trying to construct frameworks for communicating experimental results, communicating their uncertainties in a way that's reproducible across disciplines, not just in the energy area. There are a couple tools that we use. One is the the Consolidated Standards for Reporting Clinical Trials, which is just a checklist that has all of the information that you need to report for someone to understand these studies. Communicating uncertainty information is a critical piece of information that was typically left out from these prior studies. And our paper in PNAS goes through a lot of the details of actually how to do this and the supporting science behind it. And there's one last thing that I'd like to mention, which is a move across the sciences in the last 5 or 10 years of making your code and your design materials and your data and your methods publicly available. There's a lot of research supporting the idea that this really helps scientifically scientific community progress. And there's several established ways of doing this, including clinicaltrials.gov, which is more for medicine, and the open science framework, which has been used more in psychology. And something like this for energy would be, I think, extremely useful for progressing the science. And so, so just to wrap up, I'd like to thank some of my support for this work from the American Recovery and Investment Act grants from the Department of Energy, the Climate and Energy Decision-Making Center at CMU, and the Carnegie Electric Industry Center. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. I have to, we're running behind, so I'd like to get Curt in here. Curt, are you prepared? Okay.
Yes, I am.
Okay, take it away. We see your slides.
Okay, so you know, for those of you who don't know, Avista is a little utility up in Spokane, Washington, serving in the Northwest, and we've been around for 129 years. We are vertically integrated IOU with electric and gas, and as such, you know, we don't have a lot of the same tensions that the rest of the country has. We have very low on-peak, off-peak differentials. Our cost of energy is very low, and actually even our customer demands are fairly simple. But we've always had a history of innovation. In those 129 years, we've done a lot. There's a list of about 35 things that were unique at the point in time they were done, first in the world. And so some of the things, we created Itron, we created Ecova, and Rely On. So innovation is kind of at our core. And so with that being said, pilots and demonstrations are really something that we use to leverage that innovative culture to actually discover and be able to implement things that we think are important going forward. So I'm going to highlight just a little more on the innovation piece first. So we have a team, it's called the Innovation Station. It's 25 members from across the company. And their obligation is once every 2 weeks to meet and stay current with emerging trends on everything, technology, customer expectations, you name it. We have guest speakers, we do site visits, we visit incubators, and then as a sideline, we have a group called the Skunk Works, which actually pilots and prototypes things that come out of that innovation station. The last piece of that is that the innovation station members have an obligation to advocate for ideas that come through the company, employees or even externally that might get exposed. So they will put those ideas basically in the best light all the way through a business case development to determine if we should take them further. And there's a part of that process that involves deep dives where we get together for 3 weeks or 2 weeks, and it's totally focused on the particular topic, and we apply design thinking concepts to basically answer the question, how might we? So when we think about our pilots and demonstrations, we're truly trying to answer that question, how might we, and then fill in the blank for whatever it is that we're trying to accomplish. So when we look at pilot or / demonstration projects, and Anthony laid that out perfectly, there is a difference based on scale. So a lot of times our pilots might just be in that Skunk Works. It's basically creating a prototype, testing the technology, determining scalability, and then it may go further or it may not. But if it goes further, so if it gets into the demonstration phase, which is where we can really understand at a much greater level, we start really with a business case. If we can't make a business case out of it, then it probably isn't something that has top priority for us. And the business case is developed in the same way that we develop any other business case. So we look at all the potential returns, all the costs, and we calculate an ROI. Now the difference is that ROI might not meet the normal hurdle rate for the utility, because we understand that learning is very important and building expertise is very important. So oftentimes that business case might have a much lower threshold to meet, but we try to make sure that threshold is break even or better. Otherwise, we tend to look at the project as maybe not something that we need to do. And I'm going to skip scale and applicability. And the other side of that business case is that we oftentimes are trying to explore something that we don't have all the expertise. And it may be technical expertise, it may be business expertise, it may be business modeling, it may be financial, whatever it is. We then look to the public-private partnerships, and we have done a bunch of them with the state of Washington, with the Department of Energy, with Pacific Northwest National Labs, with NREL, with Washington State University, with University of Idaho. So all of those entities bring expertise that we may not have in-house, and collectively we get to learn together, and together we come up with a much stronger solution. In some of our in our ARA grant projects, I'll just throw those out as an example. We had, prior to those grants becoming available, wanted to do a 7-feeder pilot for a distribution management system. That turned into 82 feeders in 2 different projects, testing pure grid stuff and then grid stuff with customer engagement. And it was highly successful. We saved 43,000 megawatt hours a year with our efficiency part of that, which is around conservation voltage reduction. And we've saved over 5 million customer outage minutes that would have been experienced had we not put the technology in place. We also validated that customers, given a smart thermostat and control, so more of a lifestyle change versus just a smart thermostat, saved about 9.4% in their energy bill throughout the 2 years that they had their thermostats in place. So those were highly successful. They're probably our most successful pilots. Why? Because they got very big in demonstration. And this is one of the points, that there is a difference. The smaller the project, the less people get exposed to it in the company, and the harder it is to push it to an actual program, because there's not as much buy-in from the rest of the organization. But that public-private partnership really puts you in a position to distribute risk and acquire a lot more capability across the board. And usually there's some grant opportunities where we can lower the cost of entry. But why would we do most of this stuff? Well, we would do it because it all comes back to the customer. So when we look at the customer, we look at the customer as we move forward. The customer, it's all about choice. Now, that choice may be pretty passive, but as we move through time, there is a much stronger desire to have choice. It might be choice about the energy type. It might be choice about things they can do to manage their consumption. It might be just choice about how they interact with us. And then there's a real push towards locality and localizing your resources. So they may want to have those resources or those choices local to them. And then finally, and this is the scary one for utilities, but there's a desire to share, like an Uber model. So how does that work in a peer-to-peer type of a network, or a peer-to-peer arrangement? So as we think of everything, that really gets then, as we look at regulation, today's regulatory model is somewhat restrictive to be able to implement some of those things. So as we think about energy services, how do we move to more of an energy service model versus a kilowatt hour model, which doesn't actually even, it doesn't cover what we supply. We supply KVA with a power factor, and we supply peak demand. And so those two things influence greatly what is 85% of the cost to customers, which is capacity related. So as we think about these pilots, they're all basically put into a roadmap that lead us down that path of customer choice and finally customer participation. And as we draw that roadmap, we put our projects along that roadmap to get us from the beginning to the end, which is initially just choice, to finally participation by customers in an active way with resources. And with respect to that and the regulation, so I think one of the key things when we talk about regulation, I think we're fortunate we have good relationships with both of the states that we have most of our assets with. So we do have a company in Alaska. And
60 seconds. 60 seconds.
And so I think, the key thing is communication. We constantly communicate what our pilots were intended to do, how we're proceeding with them, what we're seeing, and then that whole thing when we were talking about publishing, let's get it published and available to people to see. And I'll stop there.
Thanks. I appreciate that, Curt. Thank you. Josh?
Great. Thank you. So I know I'm last. I don't have slides. I am prepared, but I just want to be very short and sweet. I figured we'd be up against the clock as we are, so I'll be very short and sweet here. So Con Edison is a electric, gas, and steam utility. Headquartered here in New York City. We are deregulated, so we don't own generation, and we're somewhere around, 10th or 11th largest utility in the country. I just wanted to talk a little bit about why innovation is different from some of the other things that we do day to day. So let's unpack that. What specifically about innovation makes it different from some of those core day-to-day activities? I would argue the heart of that is uncertainty. So no matter the specific technology or focus area or innovation that you're trying to realize, it's typically much more uncertain than the classic day-to-day things that we do as a utility, building a substation, repairing your average transmission line. And so fundamentally, we'd argue that it's that uncertainty which necessitates regulators incenting utilities to innovate by ring fencing to some degree some of that funding. So just to give you a very specific example, if we as a utility have a choice to build a substation, which we would have an allowable rate of return on that, versus make some more speculative investment that if it works, maybe it'll be better for customers, it'll be a lot cheaper, but it has a low probability of success. Something new, something we haven't tried before. In a sort of classic cost of service business model, if that investment doesn't work through, no sort of wrongdoing from a utility, we're sort of punished for making that investment. Whereas if you make the classic capital investment, you earn a allowable rate of return. So it's really, why should there be, in our opinion, ring fencing around innovation funding, and why is it different? Again, it's fundamentally that uncertainty. Now, some folks might push back and say, well, that just sounds like you just want to be allowed to do whatever you want to do as a utility, and where's the accountability around that? And so I think it's really important to note that just because funding is ring-fenced does not mean and should not mean that there is not a great degree of or cannot be a great degree of accountability or oversight for something. So, for instance, part of the pilot projects that we do here in New York, we have to produce a pro forma. So, if this works, what would be the financial impact? We have to identify the specific assumptions that you're testing. This is something that Anthony spoke to at the beginning. So what assumptions are you testing? How specifically are you testing them? And all of that is proposed to and approved by our regulator. And we've seen instances where it has not been approved. And then it is monitored in public reports over time, so quarterly, et cetera. But there is a regulatory allowance for that funding to earn a rate of return on it, again, because it's uncertain. Last but not least, the other thing I'd point out that I think is important and something that we've learned here in New York through REV, it's really important to set a clear direction. That's that strategic vision that Anthony was talking about at the beginning. The regulator can and should set that for the utilities under its jurisdiction, but also the utility itself should have that kind of clear direction. Within that mandate, I do think it's important to allow at least a little bit of flexibility for utilities to develop and test innovations for themselves. So, for instance, give a little bit of flexibility. So, you set an objective, just making this up here, to drive better renewable integration. Well, what that looks like for a utility like ourselves, a distribution utility who has primarily a mesh underground network, is going to look a lot different for a utility, for instance, in New York State, where if you go upstate or if you go to the west, that network is all overground and much less dense. So again, just want to speak about why innovation is different, why we think that should be treated differently, and just want to knock down the idea that you can't have, on the one hand, ring fencing for some funding to allow for that uncertainty, but also a great degree of accountability and transparency around how that funding is being used.
Josh, we've got about 10 minutes now for questions from all the attendees on the phone, but I did want you to explain again the definition of ring fencing. We talked about that on our pre-call, but I want to make sure all the attendees understand what you're referring to.
Sure. So the example here in New York is for our demonstration, our pilot projects. The spending associated with that is classified as what's called a regulatory asset. So there is a 10-year long rate of return. It's treated like a capital asset, but typically a much less long-lived capital asset. And then there are specific, accountability and transparency mechanisms around that. So again, you have to identify what assumptions you're testing. You have to demonstrate that that's helping you execute against the objectives that our regulator has set out. And then there's continuous sort of accountability around that. So quarterly reporting, updates, that again, all of that is public. So that's what I mean by ring fencing, both the financial accountability or the financial treatment and accounting treatment around that, but also the sort of accountability and public transparency components.
Okay, thank you, Josh. Let's go to the rest of the country. Does somebody have a question that's on the webinar? Five, four, three, two, one. Okay. First question to all of you. Have there ever been an example that you've had a pilot you thought was going to be successful, and when you put the program into fruition, it failed? Has there been an example that you guys have been involved in that this has occurred, and why?
This is Josh from Con Ed. One of the projects that we worked on was what's called a virtual power plant. So customers who have solar on their rooftops and also can pair that solar with energy storage, can then store that energy and deploy that energy in the wholesale market. We initially started that, probably 2014, 2015. The Fire Department of New York had some issues with permitting lithium-ion batteries to enable that in New York City. And so we actually put that project on hold. It's now back on, so I guess we hope and expect that it won't be a complete failure. But I do think that kind of illustrates a good point, is that we were trying to provide a service for customers, and it wasn't a kind of shortcoming of execution or planning, what we would call exogenous factors. So things that happen in the environment that you wouldn't expect. In this case, permitting with the Fire Department of New York, affected the execution of that. So that's a good example of you try something, it doesn't always work, and some of the reasons you fail might not be the ones that you expected going in.
Interesting. Thank you, Josh. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. This is Curt. I could. That same thermostat program that we had, it had some incentives to get people involved, and all of that worked for the people that were selected to participate. But if there was a failure point, it was that we as utilities are always so conservative that we restricted our opportunity to learn about it, because we didn't want to offend anybody who might want to join and not be able to join because of what they had in place for an HVAC system. And so our targeted customer list shrunk dramatically as a result. And so I think one of the learnings there, at least for me, this is my feeling. I don't know if you get it from the whole company, but we have to get over that somebody might be upset that they can't participate in a program. You have to put the information there and say, look, this is what it is. Some people may not have the right equipment to participate because oftentimes you have limited your result before you even start, just out of fear of not meeting customer expectation. And so we always have a tough balancing act there, but sometimes I think we're a little too conservative.
Thank you, Curt. Okay, questions again from the rest of the country. Anybody? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Here's something that I caught from this webinar, and it was really on the biases, Dr. Davis. There were so many biases that you actually scared me, because at some point, because we're paying for these pilots, or somebody's paying for these pilots, you want to make sure that all those variables are taken care of. But what happens, and this could go to anybody, what happens in an area that's not as maybe homogeneous as Avista in Washington? When you look at the state of Illinois, ComEd is pretty much in the populated areas of Chicago, but Ameren takes up almost all of the state. So you have almost an entire state that travels from East St. Louis up to Rockford. That's not going to be homogeneous, and so the pilot program becomes very, I guess it would be so extensive that is it worth having a pilot program when you have to deal with this many variables? Anyone can answer.
Well, this is Curt. Go ahead.
So some of the variables have to do with what's called internal validity. Internal validity is the program doing what you think it's doing? Is it causal? Another issue is external validity. External validity has to do with, will the program generalize from your sample in the study to the population? So, if the main question is external validity, and it's extremely costly to ensure external validity representative sampling in the study, where you might as well just roll this out to everyone, from a cost-benefit standpoint and from a scientific validity standpoint, you might consider rolling it out to everyone. Now, that's not the case for internal validity. For internal validity, you really cannot tell whether these things are causal without very careful design, for example, using randomization or using an experimental design that's close enough to randomization to determine, okay, this is actually, this change in energy consumption is actually the result of our program and not other factors that are co-occurring at the same time.
Very good. Very good. Kira, do you have any calls? Do you have any questions on your side?
I actually wanted to ask a clarifying question to Josh. I think you mentioned that there were some pilot programs that Con Ed had proposed to the New York Commission that did not get approved. Could you share with us maybe some of the factors that went into that kind of failure to advance to the next step? And are there any lessons that Con Ed took from those proposals to incorporate into future proposals?
Yeah, so just to clarify, well, fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not sure, it actually wasn't us who had their proposal rejected. It was another utility in New York, and I hope I have this right. So I think it was National Grid, but don't 100% quote me on that, even though we're on a webinar, because I remember that was one of the first ones proposed. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't have direct personal experience with that.
Okay, Kira, it's almost top of the hour. We want to thank everybody for their time that's been on the call. I'd like to thank my panelists, Anthony Teixeira, Dr. Alex Davis, Curt Kirkeby, and Josh Gould. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for listening. I hope this webinar has been helpful for you. Kira, it's going to be at, can you tell me about how it's, I know it's being recorded. Is it on the NARUC website?
Yes, it will be posted on the NARUC website, www.naruc.org/CPI, in a couple of days. So thank you very much to Commissioner Rosales and our panelists, and thank you everyone for listening.
Have a great day.
Yep, have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.